In the fall of 1834 at Baltimore's Inner Harbor, a fiery cargo worker made a discovery that would forever shake American medical education. Hidden beneath the salt and ice of a ship bound for Europe, he found 17 perfectly preserved bodies, each bearing the mental scars that might have been produced by a master of the science of entertainment. The cargo manifest said they were medical specimens from St. Thomas Medical College, a school in his native Maryland. But the worker realized something far more horrifying. One of the bodies bore a scar. He recognized immediately the scar of his nephew, a young man who had supposedly died of a fever while studying at the prestigious Catholic medical school. What the authorities uncovered later revealed a 36-year conspiracy, a web of murder greed and betrayal that netted more than $800,000 in blood, the equivalent of nearly $25 million today. The Walshs had turned their sacred institution into the most profitable house of horrors in America, and the evidence of their crimes was in the cargo holds of ships bound for Europe's most prestigious medical schools. Before we continue the story of the Walsh family and their criminal medical empire, I want to thank you for always supporting Sleepy History Tales, which brings true stories from America's dark past. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you don't miss this exclusive story. And what state are you watching? From comment below. I'd love to hear from mystery lovers across the country. Now let's explore a family of respected doctors who became architectural professors in one of the most elaborate murder plots in history. The long investigation not only exposes the Walsh family's crimes, but also a web of greed that extends from the Catholic Church to the top echelons of European medical academia. St. Thomas Medical College sits amid the lush hills of western Maryland, about 40 miles from Baltimore. Founded in 1798 by the ambitious Dr. Michael Walsh, the school has become known as one of the best medical schools in the country, educating Catholic doctors to serve the growing Irish and German immigrant populations. The modest 3-story red brick building with its bell roof and cross-bridge houses not only the path and laboratory, but also a small chapel where students attend daily mass. The headmaster Michael Walsh was a portly man over 6'1" in, with piercing blue eyes and neatly combed silver hair, who looked at both students and faculty in sunglasses. Born in County Cork, Ireland, Walsh studied medicine at Trinity College, Dublin, before immigrating to America in 1795 with the dream of building a famous medical family. His wife, Dr. Margaret Walsh, was appointed head of the department, a rare position for women at a time when female doctors were still a thing. Margaret was also a talented and unfriendly person, although her sharp face and fat, argumentative demeanor often made young students shy. She had studied medicine at Edinburgh, one of the few European schools that accepted women, and was considered the world's leading expert in medicine at the time. The third member of the Walsh power trio was Dr. James Walsh Michael's younger brother, who certainly taught entertainment. If Michael charmed with his charm and Margaret with her severity, James stood out with his meticulousness and precision. James's entertainment was legendary among his students, not only for his technical prowess, but also for the quality of the specimens he used. While many other schools struggled with what could be preserved economically or even resorted to eating corpses from the cemetery, St. Thomas had to constantly source fresh, perfectly preserved bodies for entertainment. St. Thomas Medical University attracted students from across the eastern United States, especially young men, from poor Catholic families of Irish and German descent, who saw medicine as a path to respectability and prosperity. Many of these students had worked hard to save money for their education, drawn by the school's reputation and the promise that a degree would open doors to opportunity in the large Catholic community. Tuition was not cheap. Nearly $200 a year, a worker's salary was about $300 a year. However, the Walshs had a work-study program allowing poor students to support the school in exchange for a tuition discount. What made St. Thomas particularly appealing was its emphasis on hands-on training. While many other medical schools taught theory, the Walshs insisted that students get hands-on experience with human anatomy. The school's anatomy lab was a source of pride with its many operating tables, state-of-the-art surgical instruments, and seemingly endless supply of cadavers for study. St. Thomas graduates were known in the medical community for their excellent surgical skills and profound anatomical knowledge. The community around Emmitsburg became accustomed to the comings and goings of medical students and faculty. Local businesses prospered from the school's activities, and many families took in students as their homes. The Walsh family also developed close ties with local Catholic parishes. Michael Walsh often spoke at Mass, emphasizing the sanctity of the medical profession and the importance of healing patients as a service to God. But beneath the mask of morality and religion, something terrible was brewing. The school's remarkable success in training talented doctors turned out to come at a price no one in the surrounding community could have imagined. The Walsh family recognized that its strategic location far from major cities to avoid scrutiny, but close to transportation routes for business, would be an advantage for a dark operation that preyed on the most vulnerable in the academic community. The first sign that something was amiss at St. Thomas came in the spring of 1799, less than a year after the school was founded. Patrick O'Brien, a 19-year-old Boston native whose family had paid for him to study medicine, disappeared during his last month of school. According to school records, Patrick was struggling with his studies and volunteered to take extra anatomy practice sessions with Dr. James Walsh to improve his grades before final exams. But the circumstances of Patrick's disappearance were strange. His roommate, Thomas Mackenzie, later recalled that Patrick had seemed unusually restless in the days before his disappearance, had heard strange noises coming from the dissection room at night, and had expressed concern about some special procedures that Dr. James Walsh had begun to use in his advanced classes. On the night of May 15, 1799, around 9 p.m., Patrick left his dorm room telling Thomas that he was going to the dissection room to study late, but he never returned. The next morning, when Thomas reported Patrick missing, it was Principal Michael Walsh who took charge of the matter. He explained that Patrick had gone to the dissection room, but the pressure of studying and the horrifying images of surgery had caused him to collapse. According to Walsh, Patrick suffered a nervous breakdown and expressed his intention to drop out of school and return to Boston. He said Patrick had left school early in the morning, taking only a few essentials and leaving a letter apologizing to his family for disappointing them. The letter Patrick left behind, which was never shown to other students or his family, is believed to have contained a request for the school not to contact his parents because he was too embarrassed by his failure. Dr. Walsh reassured Thomas and the other students that Patrick's decision, while regrettable, was not uncommon for young men to find the realities of medicine much more difficult than they had imagined. But what made Patrick's disappearance so suspicious was the way the Walsh family reacted when Patrick's parents arrived at the school after 2 weeks without hearing from their son. Margaret Walsh met them in the school's reception hall in a cool, professional, but distant manner. She recounted the story of Patrick's nervous breakdown and his decision to drop out of school. However, when Patrick's mother asked to see his belongings, or the letter he left behind, Margaret explained that Patrick had asked that all his possessions be donated to charity and that his personal effects had been distributed to needy students. Patrick's father, a hard-working worker who had sacrificed years of wages to send his son to school, became increasingly frustrated during the meeting. He insisted that his son had never left without notice, that Patrick had written home regularly, and that in his last letter he had expressed enthusiasm for his studies. Margaret Walsh remained adamant, arguing that young men often conceal their difficulties from their families, and that Patrick's mental breakdown had been sudden and severe. The O'Briens' attempts to involve local authorities were also fruitless. Police Chief William Hawkins, who had been close to the Walshs and often dined at their home, conducted what he called a thorough investigation. He interviewed several students, all of whom confirmed that Patrick had seemed confused and anxious in his final days. More importantly, Dr. James Walsh produced detailed medical records that showed Patrick's academic decline and his doubts about his chosen profession. What the sheriff's investigation failed to uncover, however, was far more horrifying than mere academic failure. A secret that remained only to the Walsh family was that Patrick O'Brien had actually attended the late-night anatomy class on May 15th. But instead of a revision session, Patrick had taken a comprehensive practical exam, which Dr. James Walsh said was state-of-the-art and used in leading European medical schools. Patrick was taken to a secret laboratory in the school's basement, not shown on the architectural plans, accessible only through a hidden door behind a bookcase in James Walsh's office. In this closed room, Patrick was subjected to an advanced method of studying anatomy, using techniques that the professor claimed would prepare students for the realities of surgery. The procedure involved giving Patrick a precisely calculated dose of chloroform, a newly discovered anesthetic that James Walsh had obtained through his contacts with European doctors. Introduced as a mandatory part of the exam, the anesthetic was designed to test his knowledge of anatomy while under the influence of medical gases, Walsh explained. What Patrick did not know was that the dose of chloroform was not just a test anesthetic, but was actually designed to kill him slowly and painlessly. James Walsh spent months perfecting the technique, determining the exact amount of drug needed to cause respiratory failure without leaving any trace of violence. As Patrick slowly lost consciousness, believing himself to be participating in a legitimate medical procedure, James Walsh began the process of preserving the body, using the sophisticated embalming techniques he had learned during his studies in Edinburgh. The process was a work of art, dark, meticulous, and macabre. Using a unique combination of arsenic mercury and alcohol solutions, James Walsh was able to preserve bodies in such perfect condition for months that they were virtually indistinguishable from those of a recently deceased person. The process involved replacing the body's blood with a preservative solution, meticulously injecting chemicals into major arteries and veins, while simultaneously draining all natural fluids. The resulting specimens retained their natural color and flexibility, making them invaluable for anatomical research. Just days after Patrick was murdered, His body was carefully preserved and packed into a special shipping crate filled with salt and ice. The crate was labeled a medical specimen, then shipped to the port of Baltimore and onto a ship bound for Edinburgh. The University of Edinburgh, desperate for high-quality anatomical specimens for its prestigious medical program, agreed to pay a hefty sum, $500 for each perfectly preserved body, more than double the annual salary of most American workers at the time. The success of this first murder laid the foundation for the Walsh's operation for the next 35 years. They realized that their position as educators gave them access to a constant supply of vulnerable young men, many of whom came from families too poor or too remote to investigate thoroughly when their children disappeared. More importantly, they developed a system that allowed them to reasonably dispose of these students with acceptable explanations for their absence. Patrick O'Brien's disappearance was the beginning of a carefully planned murder spree that would leave 156 young men dead over 3 decades. But the Walsh's operation was not a series of random murders, but an organized enterprise that required careful planning, precise execution, and a complex web of deception that extended far beyond the University of St. Thomas campus. In the months following Patrick's disappearance, the Walshes refined their victim selection process. They identified the characteristics that made students ideal targets: boys from remote areas whose families had little investigative ability, those who were struggling academically and could easily be assumed to have dropped out, and especially those with few close friends in the school community. The work-study program, originally designed to help poor students get an education, became a hunting trap for the Walshes. Dr. Margaret Walsh, as dean of the school, had access to detailed information about each student, including their family background, financial situation, and social connections on campus. Students who met their criteria were gradually ushered into advanced learning opportunities, special programs that promised further training, but were really designed to isolate them from their peers and communities. The basement laboratory where Patrick O'Brien lost his life was also expanded and improved over the years. James Walsh built an elaborate murder room disguised as a medical facility. The room contained multiple operating tables, modern surgical instruments, and a body preservation system that was far ahead of its time. The walls were decorated with medical books and anatomical charts, giving the impression of a legitimate training facility while concealing its truly horrifying purpose. The body preservation techniques that James Walsh developed were truly groundbreaking for their time. Combining traditional embalming methods with new chemical formulas, he could preserve bodies perfectly for months, even years. The multi-step process began with the careful draining of blood and replacement with a preservative solution. This was followed by injections of special chemicals into the organs and tissues of the body. Finally, an external treatment was performed to preserve the natural appearance and suppleness of the bodies. The result was specimens that were far superior to anything produced by European medical schools at the time. The financial side of the operation was managed by Dr. Michael Walsh. He used his prestige and qualifications to build relationships with European medical schools in Edinburgh, London, Paris, and Dublin, convincing them that St. Thomas's College had an exceptional supply of fresh cadavers due to its proximity to numerous hospitals and its connections with the local Catholic parish. The European medical schools, desperate for high-quality anatomical specimens and trusting the recommendation of a fellow Catholic doctor, agreed to pay a high price for these perfectly preserved bodies. The transportation was extremely complex and required careful coordination. The bodies were packed in special crates that looked like ordinary medical packages. The crates were filled with salt ice and sawdust to maintain temperature and prevent decomposition during the long ocean voyage. Shipping records clearly stated that the contents were anatomical specimens or medical research papers, and the crates were labeled with the names of legitimate medical organizations. The Walshes had established relationships with many shipping companies, and shipments to Europe became a regular part of Baltimore's port trade. To protect their cover, the Walshes created elaborate fake files for each student who disappeared. They kept detailed records of academic records, discipline, and personal problems to provide a plausible explanation for the students' departure. They even forged letters from students' home explaining their reasons for dropping out and finding other opportunities. These letters, carefully written by James Walsh, often referred to personal shame, financial hardship, or loss of faith in the medical profession. The local community was largely unaware of the dark truth behind the Walsh family's activities. The school's reputation grew, and its alumni were highly regarded for their excellent surgical skills and extensive anatomical knowledge. Local businesses also thrived on the school's clientele. The Walsh family was a respected member of the community, often donating generously to charities and churches. Chief Hawkins, who had investigated several missing students, maintained a trusting relationship with the Walsh family and rarely questioned their explanations for the students' sudden disappearances. The selection of victims was carefully planned. Each year, the Walsh family would select between 4 and 6 students who fit the criteria. The murders usually took place during the winter when shipments to Europe slowed, allowing them to accumulate more preserved bodies before shipping. This period also coincided with the most stressful academic period at the school, when students were understandably depressed or decided to drop out. By 1810, 12 years after the murder of Patrick O'Brien, the Walsh family had murdered 43 students and had earned over $200,000 from European buyers. The business was thriving, leading them to expand their facilities and plan to increase production. However, success also brought new challenges as the number of missing students increased, attracting attention from beyond the local community. The first serious threat to the Walsh family's operations came in the spring of 1811 when Father Timothy O'Malley arrived in St. Thomas. In the spring of 1811, the first serious threat to the functioning of St. Thomas College came when Father Timothy O'Malley arrived on campus to investigate concerns raised by several Irish parishes in Boston and New York. Father O'Malley was a strict, cautious priest who acted as an informal link between Irish Catholic families and educational institutions. More than a dozen families contacted him concerned that their sons seemed to be mysteriously dropping out of medical school at St. Thomas. What troubled Father O'Malley was not just the number of cases, but the strange coincidences in the circumstances of each disappearance. He began his investigation by examining each case closely. Each missing student had been described as having difficulty with his studies in the weeks before his disappearance, despite having previously performed well. Each seemed to have left the college abruptly, often at night, without saying goodbye to roommates or close friends. Even more disturbing, each family received a letter from the school explaining why their child had dropped out, but none received a letter directly from the students themselves. When Father O'Malley arrived at St. Thomas, he was warmly welcomed by Dr. Michael Walsh, who expressed sympathy for the priest's concerns and promised to cooperate fully with the investigation. Mr. Walsh explained that the pressures of medical school were intense, with many boys from poor families being overwhelmed by the academic demands. He also stressed that while the school produced excellent doctors, its high standards also meant that its student dropout rate was higher than at other schools. However, Father O'Malley's interviews with current students revealed a disturbing picture. Some boys said they had heard strange noises coming from the basement at night, an area students were not allowed to enter. Several others said they were uncomfortable with some of the advanced learning opportunities offered to struggling students, though none could say why. Most notably, several students said that those who had previously been reported to have dropped out had expressed enthusiasm for their studies in their final conversations, making their sudden departures seem unlikely. The priest's investigation became more serious when he attempted to verify the school's claims about the students dropping out. When he asked to see the letters left behind by the students, Dr. Margaret Walsh explained that the school's policy was to respect student privacy, so personal correspondence was not kept in the files. When Father O'Malley asked to see the missing students' academic records, he was provided with reports of declining academic performance and behavioral problems. However, the priest noticed that many of the notes had similar handwriting and ink, raising suspicions that they might have been made all at once rather than over several months. Father O'Malley's most shocking discovery came when he tried to contact the families of students who had dropped out years earlier. Using church records and parish contacts across the Northeast, he found many families who had never heard from their children after the school's initial announcement. These families had spent years searching for their sons, trying every possible way to find no trace of the boys. Had it not been for a well-organized campaign of intimidation and misdirection, Father O'Malley's investigation might have exposed the Walsh family's entire dark plot. Sensing the priest's threat, Dr. James Walsh began spreading rumors about his mental health, suggesting that the investigation stemmed from a personal conflict with the school. The Walsh family also secretly sent Father O'Malley several anonymous letters, warning him that if the investigation continued, he would face serious consequences for his safety and career. The decisive moment came when Father O'Malley insisted on inspecting the school's basement laboratories, believing that students might be being held against their will. Dr. Michael Walsh initially refused, citing medical safety concerns and the need to protect ongoing research projects. However, when Father O'Malley threatened to take the matter to civil authorities, Walsh agreed to allow a limited inspection of certain areas. The inspection was carefully staged. Father O'Malley was taken to only a few basement rooms containing legitimate medical equipment and supplies, including a fully equipped dissection room with several cadavers purchased through legitimate channels. Dr. James Walsh detailed the school's anatomy curriculum and demonstrated body preservation techniques that he claimed were standard in European medical schools. But what Father O'Malley did not see was the secret laboratory hidden behind a bookshelf in James Walsh's office, where the murders and body preservation actually took place. Father O'Malley's investigation ended without clear evidence of wrongdoing, but the priest left St. Thomas with serious doubts about the school's operations. He sent a report to Catholic authorities in Baltimore, calling for closer supervision and stressing that the high dropout rate needed to be thoroughly investigated. However, the Walsh family's reputation and connections in the Catholic medical community meant that Father O'Malley's concerns were not properly pursued. The near exposure forced the Walsh family to change its methods. They reduced the number of victims per year from an average of 6 to 4, lengthened the gap between disappearances, and created more elaborate cover stories. They began selecting victims from more remote areas, making it harder for the families to investigate. Most importantly, the Walshes built a network of informants in the community who could alert them to any suspicious investigations or interrogations. They also diversified their operations, establishing relationships with other medical schools around the world, expanding the market for preserved specimens. By 1815, specimens were being sent not only to Europe, but also to medical schools in South America and the Caribbean. The expanding market allowed the Walshes to raise their prices and become more selective, prioritizing young, healthy victims to produce superior quality specimens. By 1820, their operation had developed into a sophisticated criminal organization, generating huge profits while maintaining a veneer of academic prestige. However, their success also attracted the attention of rivals and created weaknesses that could threaten the entire operation. Their renowned preservation techniques led the European medical community to gradually question the origins of their specimens. In the fall of 1820, Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann, a German physician who had purchased many specimens from the University of St. Thomas, arrived in Baltimore to investigate the source of the most excellently preserved cadavers he had ever seen. Zimmermann, who taught anatomy at the University of Heidelberg, had been using specimens from St. Thomas for 2 years and was curious about the miraculous preservation process. He wrote to Dr. James Walsh asking for permission to observe the preservation process firsthand, saying he wanted to learn something for his own practice. The arrival of Dr. Zimmermann created an unprecedented crisis for the Walsh family. The Walsh family could not allow Dr. Zimmermann to observe their actual preservation process firsthand, as that would expose the fact that they were working with recently murdered bodies, not those who had died naturally. At the same time, they could not afford to lose a client who had spent over $15,000 on specimens and had connections to several European medical schools. They decided to create a false show that would satisfy Zimmermann's curiosity while keeping the real secret hidden. Dr. James Walsh prepared a presentation using the body of an elderly person who had died, naturally donated to the school by the family. The demonstration took place in a legitimate dissection room, with Walsh explaining the preservation techniques using a combination of real methods and fictional innovations. He claimed the exceptional quality of the specimens came from the unique climate of Western Maryland and his connections with local Catholic hospitals and parishes, which gave them access to recently deceased bodies. Dr. Zimmermann was initially impressed, but an experienced eye quickly detected something unusual in Walsh's explanation. The techniques demonstrated could not possibly produce the same excellent results as the specimens he had purchased. The bodies from St. Thomas showed no signs of decomposition typical of natural death, and the quality of preservation far exceeded what the methods demonstrated could achieve. When Zimmermann pressed him further, Dr. Walsh evaded, citing some of the secrets as trade secrets that could not be revealed. This response only increased Zimmermann's suspicions. He began to investigate the school's operations more closely. interviewing students and inspecting facilities looking for evidence of the advanced techniques required to create the astonishing specimen in his possession. His investigation led him to a terrifying discovery. When he reviewed shipping records at the Baltimore port, Zimmerman discovered that St. Thomas University had sent more than 200 preserved bodies to European medical institutions over the past 20 years. The number seemed incredible for a small medical school one with connections to local hospitals and parishes. Even more disturbing, the records showed that the specimens were sent to institutions that had not ordered them from St. Thomas. The German doctor's investigation might have exposed the Walsh family's dark plot had it not been for the decisive intervention of Dr. Michael Walsh. On the night of October 15, 1820, Zimmerman was invited to attend a special demonstration of advanced preservation techniques in the basement laboratory of the medical school. He was promised the secret, which had been kept secret for so long, and the demonstration would answer all his questions. However, when Zimmerman arrived at 9 p.m., instead of witnessing the advanced technique, he met the same fate as the 156 medical students who had been murdered over the past 22 years. The German doctor was given a carefully calculated dose of chloroform, labeled to demonstrate the use of anesthesia in anatomical research, but in reality, intended to kill him gently and painlessly. Dr. Zimmerman's murder marked a serious escalation in the Walsh family's crimes. Unlike the previous victims, he was a respected physician with extensive connections in the European medical community, and his disappearance would be investigated much more thoroughly. To cover up the Walsh family, concocted a false story about Zimmerman having to return to Europe abruptly for a family matter, leaving Baltimore at the last minute. They falsified records showing that he had booked a ticket to Hamburg and hired witnesses to say they had seen Zimmerman at the port on the day of his departure. Preserving Dr. Zimmerman's body posed unique challenges for the Walsh family. Unlike the young medical students who had been their typical victims, Dr. Zimmerman was older and his body bore the marks of disease and the damage of old age. James Walsh was forced to use far more advanced preservation techniques to restore the body to a state of perfection acceptable to European buyers. The process took weeks, requiring the use of experimental chemicals that Walsh had developed to enhance the quality of the specimens. Dr. Zimmerman's preserved body was eventually sent to the University of Edinburgh, where it was accepted as part of a regular order of anatomical specimens. The irony was not lost on James Walsh that Dr. Zimmerman's body would be dissected by the same medical students who had studied on the bodies of his previous victims. The body was so well preserved that it was used for advanced surgical demonstrations and was praised by a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh as one of the best specimens ever obtained. The success of the Zimmerman murder convinced the Walsh family that there was no threat they could not eliminate, regardless of who the victim was or what their connections were. However, this overconfidence also led to their downfall as they became increasingly reckless and underestimated the determination of those who wanted to expose their crimes. If this story is making you shiver, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Don't forget to support the content and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on stories like this. Let's continue to explore what will happen in this story of greed and medical crime. The turning point that led to the downfall of Walsh's criminal empire came from an unexpected source, one of his victims. In the spring of 1830, Thomas Mackenzie, Patrick O'Brien's roommate, and one of the few people who had suspected his friend's mysterious disappearance 35 years earlier, had become a successful physician in Philadelphia. Mackenzie never forgot the strange circumstances surrounding Patrick's departure from St. Thomas. Over the years, he quietly investigated the fates of other students who had disappeared under similar circumstances. Mackenzie's investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. Through contacts with Catholic parishes in the Northeast, he identified more than 40 families whose sons were believed to have dropped out of medical school at St. Thomas but had not been heard from since. These families spent decades waiting for answers, and many tried various means but never found a trace of their children. Mackenzie's breakthrough came when he met Dr. Wilhelm Schneider, a German physician who had studied at the University of Edinburgh, who had become curious about the quality of the excellent anatomical specimens that the Scottish Medical School had received from an American medical school. Schneider examined dozens of preserved bodies sent from the University of St. Thomas and discovered a number of frightening patterns. The first was the astonishing consistency in the quality of preservation. Each sample from St. Thomas showed an exceptional level of preservation without any signs of decay or damage that would normally occur in a natural death. The preservation technique was clearly superior to anything available in Europe at the time, suggesting that they possessed secrets that were not widely publicized. The second point was the demographic homogeneity of the specimens. Almost all were young men between the ages of 18 and 25 in good health when they died. None of the specimens bore any signs of disease or significant trauma, which would be inconceivable if the bodies were those of people who died naturally, since this age group often died from accidents. Violence or acute illness, causes that would leave obvious marks on the body. The third and most frightening point, the cause of death. Through careful analysis, Schneider found that many of the specimens showed signs of respiratory failure, but no disease or trauma could explain this. The lungs and respiratory system were normal, but the cellular damage suggested that the victims had died of asphyxiation or respiratory failure, possibly caused by chemicals. When Schneider shared his findings with Mackenzie, the American doctor realized that they had found evidence of a systematic killing program. The two embark on a comprehensive investigation that will ultimately expose the Walsh family's crimes and end a 36-year reign of terror. Their investigation focuses on shipping records at the port of Baltimore, which show that St. Thomas University sent the St. Thomas Medical College shipped more than 400 carefully preserved bodies to European medical institutions between 1798 and 1834, an impossible number for a legitimate medical school, even with its connections to local hospitals and parishes. More disturbingly, shipping records show that the bodies were sent to medical institutions across Europe, creating a vast distribution network that was beyond the reach of a small American medical school. Doctors Mackenzie and Schneider decided to confront the Walsh family directly. In July 1834, they traveled to St. Thomas under the pretense of learning about advanced preservation techniques on behalf of European medical institutions. They requested a tour of the entire facility and a first-hand look at the preservation process that had produced such miraculous specimens. The arrival of Mackenzie and Schneider plunged the Walsh family into crisis. They realized Mackenzie was Patrick O'Brien's former roommate and knew that this investigation directly threatened their criminal network. But at the same time, They could not simply refuse to cooperate with the investigators without raising suspicion and opening up a wider investigation by the authorities. Dr. Michael Walsh decided on a final solution to eliminate the risk that Mackenzie and Schneider represented. He invited the two guests to a special demonstration of advanced preservation techniques held in the secret laboratory in the basement of the school. He promised that this time they would hear all the secrets they had ever craved. The demonstration was scheduled for the evening of July 23, 1834. Walsh assured Mackenzie and Schneider that they would have answers to all their questions. But fortunately, the two doctors had prepared everything in advance. Before arriving at the school, they reported their findings to authorities in Philadelphia and Baltimore and asked colleagues to follow them if they did not return. Most importantly, they had hidden detailed documents about the investigation in various locations, ensuring that their evidence would be preserved no matter what they encountered. The confrontation in the basement laboratory was fast and furious. When Mackenzie and Schneider arrived, they confronted Dr. James Walsh and two assistants in a secret room that had witnessed the deaths of 156 young men over the past 36 years. The laboratory was filled with operating tables, sophisticated surgical instruments, and undeniable evidence of a systematic murder spree and sophisticated body preservation. Dr. James Walsh attempted to poison two of his guests with chloroform, using the same technique that had killed Patrick O'Brien and dozens of other victims. But Mackenzie and Schneider were armed and ready to fight. The melee was violent, ending with James Walsh dead and both doctors critically wounded. The sound of gunfire echoed throughout the school, drawing the attention of students and faculty who rushed to the scene to investigate. What they saw in the secret lab was a horrifying sight they would never forget. It contained evidence of decades of organized murder, preserved body parts, bloody surgical instruments, and detailed records of the victims and the European medical institutions that had purchased the specimens. The ensuing investigation exposed the full extent of the Walsh family's crimes. Authorities found records showing that 156 young men had been murdered at St. Thomas from 1798 to 1834, and their preserved bodies were sold to European medical institutions for a total of more than $800,000, a huge sum at the time. The files also revealed that the entire crime was meticulously planned by the Walsh family, who kept detailed records of each victim and each body transaction to European medical institutions. When the horrifying truth about St. Thomas Medical College was revealed, it sent shockwaves through the medical communities of both the United States and Europe. The revelation that a prestigious medical school under the guise of morality and religion had turned itself into an organized murder machine for profit shook the foundational beliefs about medical education and the integrity of academic institutions. The ensuing investigation exposed a web of corruption and complicity that extended far beyond the Walsh family, forever changing the way medical schools around the world collect and use anatomical specimens. Dr. Michael Walsh and his wife Margaret were arrested on charges of murder conspiracy and fraud. The trial became one of the most sensational criminal cases in American history, attracting attention not only domestically but also as far away as Europe. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of a systematic series of murders, including detailed records that Dr. James Walsh had meticulously kept of each victim and of his dealings with the European medical institutions. The defense attempted to argue that the Walsh family had been driven to their crimes by the incredible pressures of medical education and the lack of legal sources of bodies. They argued that the murders were acts of charity intended to save struggling students from the shame of failure and to contribute to medical science by donating their bodies for research. However, this argument was quickly undermined by evidence of the enormous profits the family had made from the crimes. Margaret Walsh was the most determined figure in the trial. During her cross-examination, she was unapologetic, even boasting about the quality of medical education at St. Thomas and the contributions her preserved specimens made to European medicine. She asserted that the young men who died had achieved immortality through their service to medical science, and that their deaths had saved many more lives by advancing surgical techniques and anatomical knowledge. The trial also revealed chilling details about how the Walsh family selected and killed their victims. Evidence showed that they specifically targeted poor students who were less likely to have their families check in on them when they disappeared. They kept detailed psychological profiles of potential victims, identifying boys who were socially isolated or heartbroken from being away from home, making them easy to manipulate and less likely to be noticed by their peers when they went missing. Testimonies from surviving students described a university filled with fear and suspicion. Many people said they felt uneasy around some of the faculty and avoided situations alone with school officials. Some heard strange noises coming from the basement but were too afraid to investigate. Not only the victims but the entire student body lived in the atmosphere of terror created by the Walsh family. The case also had an equally chilling international impact. The investigation revealed that prestigious medical institutions in Europe had been unwittingly purchasing the bodies of murdered victims for 3 decades. If this story gives you the creeps, share this video with your friends who are passionate about dark mysteries. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next thrilling stories from Sleepy History Tales. Where are you watching the video? Let me know in the comments. I'm happy to connect with the community of history and mystery lovers across the country. Prestigious universities such as the University of Edinburgh, the University of Paris, the Royal College of Surgeons of London, and dozens of other medical institutions were forced to confront the painful truth their anatomical collections contained: the bodies of young Americans who had been murdered for their medical value. The European response was swift and fierce. Medical schools across the continent enacted stricter policies requiring transparent documentation of the provenance of anatomical specimens. Many institutes conducted extensive searches of their collections, trying to identify specimens that might have come from St. Thomas Medical College. Some schools held memorials for the anonymous victims whose bodies had been used in medical education without their consent. A financial investigation revealed the enormous scale of the profits the Walsh family had reaped. Over 36 years, they had made more than $800,000 at the time, about $25 million today. The money was invested in real estate across Maryland and Virginia, in shipping companies that transported the goods, and in European banks that acted as intermediaries for international transactions. The trial ended in November 1834, with the death sentences of Michael and Margaret Walsh, the first Americans executed for crimes related to medical education. They were hanged in front of more than 3,000 spectators witnessing the collapse of America's most notorious medical murder case. The fate of the victims' families became the focus of public attention. Many had waited for decades. The truth brought both comfort and horror. Some families sued for compensation. Others just wanted their children to be buried properly. Identifying the victims was a challenge, as many bodies had long been sent to Europe and their whereabouts were unknown. The St. Thomas Medical School was closed permanently after the truth was revealed. The building was later demolished and the land sold to a farming family who were unaware of its dark past. Locals say the area is still haunted by strange sounds and unexplained phenomena for years after the building was demolished. Whether this is supernatural or the psychological effects of the horrific crime remains a mystery. The Walsh case had a profound and lasting impact on medical education in the United States. It prompted the enactment of strict regulations on the collection and use of anatomical specimens. Medical schools must keep detailed records of the origins of bodies and ensure that all specimens are legally obtained. The Walsh case shocked not only the horror of the crime, but also opened up a wider debate about the ethics of medical education and the responsibilities of teachers to their students. The international medical community was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the demand for anatomical specimens and the pressure this placed on medical schools to source cadavers. The high prices that European medical schools were willing to pay for perfectly preserved cadavers created a market that encouraged crime. Medical schools in Europe and the United States have since developed alternative methods for teaching anatomy, such as artificial models and the use of more limited legal cadavers. The psychological impact on the medical profession has been equally profound. Doctors who studied at schools that used specimens from St. Thomas were forced to confront the possibility that their education had been built on murder. Many doctors even left the profession unable to reconcile their commitment to healing with the Walsh's unwitting participation in the crimes. The case also shook American society's faith in educational institutions. Parents everywhere began to doubt the idea of sending their children away from home, prompting many schools to institute new policies aimed at improving communication between schools and families. Documents recovered from the Walsh's secret lab have opened an unprecedented window for historians, revealing the scale and systematic nature of a brutal murder enterprise. The detailed records include not only victim information but also correspondence with European medical schools, financial reports, and technical notes on body preservation methods. The preservation techniques developed by James Walsh have amazed forensic and medical experts with their sophistication and effectiveness beyond their time. Despite their horrific uses, these advances were adopted by mainstream medical institutions despite St. Thomas's dark history. The investigation also exposed the depth of corruption by the Walsh family toward local officials and community leaders. Police Chief William Hawkins, who had investigated several student disappearances, was found to have accepted bribes to ease the investigation. Several local businessmen who helped transport bodies to Europe were also indicted, although most received light sentences for cooperating with authorities. Religiously, the case was deeply hurtful to the Catholic community because the crimes occurred at a Catholic medical facility and were committed by people who claimed to be devout believers. The American Church was forced to establish stricter oversight of Catholic educational institutions, increasing regular inspections of finances and facilities. European medical schools that purchased specimens from St. Thomas also faced a major overhaul of the cadaver procurement process to avoid purchasing bodies that had been the result of crime. Millions of dollars were lost as many schools rejected or returned specimens. The fund for the families of the 156 victims became a symbol of national philanthropy, providing some relief to families who had suffered a long-lasting loss. While no amount of money could replace the funds, it allowed many families to hold memorial services and ease the financial burden of trying to find out the truth. The Walsh case also set an important legal precedent, bringing the first criminal trial of a commercial murder case involving medical education. International treaties were subsequently established to strictly regulate the trade of anatomical specimens between countries. The story is a tragic testament to the consequences of unchecked ambition and corruption in institutions that were designed to protect and educate. The Walsh family reminds us that evil can lurk in the most prestigious places when greed overshadows humanity and oversight is lax. What do you think of this story? Has the truth been revealed, or could other medical schools harbor similar dark secrets? Leave a comment below. If you love historical horror stories like this, be sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share the video with your friends who love to explore mysteries. The past holds many secrets, and some of them are scarier than we can imagine. See you in the next video from Sleepy History Tales.